Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This is Scaling Offline Marketing. We shall be introducing our guests shortly. But first, a couple housekeeping rules. This webinar is being recorded. I will send an email with the link once the event ends, and I have the recording. Also, just a quick reminder, there's a chat. We can feel free to ask any questions there or any remark. We'll be checking it and making sure it gets answered. All right, Anish, mic on to you.
Hey, my name's Anish. My background was actually running growth at different companies, both full-time and as a consultant. Spent 11 years in San Francisco. I moved to New York about 2.5 years ago, and then began recruiting for clients, kind of with the whole idea that people who have experience and knowledge within marketing, growth, analytics, whatnot, build your own teams, launch your own campaigns, we'd be a better fit to recruit than folks who don't have experience within these areas. So I ended up building up an executive recruiting firm. We're now a team of 10, and we basically recruit for high growth startups, mostly within growth-oriented roles, and generally on the more senior side.
Hi, my name is Avital. I actually started my marketing career in Tel Aviv, Israel, a few years ago. I moved 4 years ago to New York. I started my career in the digital side, and I guess when I worked at Wix.com, I got the opportunity to do the switch and to move from the digital side to the offline side. It was very challenging, but also fascinating. And since then, I'm doing offline at Wix. When I moved here, I started working at a dormy. I had offline marketing there. And 2 years ago, I moved to Freshly, where I started the offline team, started their TV marketing campaigns, and I'm there since.
Hi, I'm Yousuf. I've been in, I'm based out of the Bay Area. I've been in growth for about 12 years or so, primarily B2C companies, companies like Disney, Zynga, Eaze, CSC Generation, Class Dojo. And most recently, I was for 3 years at Eaze in a consumer growth role, building out their growth team. Most of what I talk about will be based off of Eaze. Because the company's a cannabis delivery startup, really large, 10% of California's cannabis tax revenue, and we were not allowed to do most of the traditional digital channels, so we really had to figure out out of home. Right now, I left Eaze, doing a little bit of consulting, a couple side projects on scaling word of mouth acquisition, and excited to share my experience.
Hi everyone, my name is Molly Laufer and I'm based in the Bay Area. I've been working in startup marketing for about the last 10 years, and I got my start as an early employee at NatureBox, which is a direct-to-consumer e-commerce snack company. I actually started in influencer marketing, but made the jump from kind of online influencers to podcast hosts. So podcast advertising was really my first jump into offline marketing. And then as the company scaled, got more involved in managing channels like radio and TV. I was there for about 4 years. And then I spent a few years at an offline performance marketing agency, working across primarily audio and linear TV for a number of consumer tech companies. And most recently, I spent about 1.5 years at HomeLight, which is a real estate tech company, where I managed our TV and our radio and direct mail program. I spent the last couple of months breaking out on my own. I'm now a growth marketing consultant. I'm specifically focused in the inflection point when companies are ready to jump from the digital side to the offline side. And I'm excited to be here, and probably will be sharing most of my experience from NatureBox and HomeLight, different companies, different industries, different audiences.
Hi everyone, my name is Gavin. It is nice to see some familiar names on this chat today. I started my career back in New York on the media agency side, so working with larger brands from the offline world, and then sort of got into the growth world after moving to Los Angeles and joining Dollar Shave Club, and came in there focused on TV and radio, but started to adopt other channels and growing out the influencer program there. And then have been working with a few other brands since then. And today at Honey, I lead a team of offline marketers focused on growth, scaling those channels, which consist anywhere from linear TV to streaming TV to influencers, direct mail, out of home, podcast, radio, etc.
Awesome. So for all of you lovely people who RSVP'd to this event, many of you put in questions that you'd like today's offline marketing experts to answer. So we picked out the 10 of them that we all felt were kind of interesting and would be fun to chat through. And so this is the first one. Whenever offline is kind of brought up, the first question that everyone kind of asks is like, how do you nail attribution? And that's also the toughest question. And it's also the one nobody ever feels confident in that they've really nailed it. So I know that there's the spike model. There's some newer stuff that's popped up. You can do coupon codes. I'd love to learn. This is honestly, like, we could probably talk the entire hour on attribution because it's the hardest thing to get right. But I'd love to learn from all of you guys. We'll start with Avital, then Gavin, then Molly, then Yousuf. Like,
Yeah,
how do you approach it? And what's worked, what hasn't worked? I want to hear about spectacular failures, everything.
oh, dirt. Yeah, it's a great question to start, and definitely the hardest one, because coming from the digital side, you're used to, the conversation is always about first touch, last touch, multi-touch. The problem with offline, sometimes there is just no touch. Sometimes people are coming without UTM source, without the UTM parameters, with all kinds of channels, and it's really hard to say, okay, you actually watched the TV ad, you came from direct mail. So the idea is basically to try to combine as many different models as possible and hope this will lead you to the right direction. So it can be either, looking at the uplift from before you started the TV campaign, after you started the TV campaign, and basically trying to understand what is this incremental lift and what is the contribution to your volume, to the number of new customers. Of course, you mentioned promo codes. You mentioned you can also look at how did you hear about us survey. So you put a survey after the customer purchased, and you ask him how did you hear about us. If he answered TV, you basically know he's a TV person. You can also, when you have enough data, you can also combine regression models like marketing mix model to try to understand the contribution of your different offline channels. So basically, you hope that all of these are going to direct you to the right directions and give you the answer, but you never get to an accuracy. So don't get your hopes too high.
You haven't figured out the magic bullet that no one else has been able to figure out. You can't tell me that right now. Okay. And Gavin?
Yeah, similar thought process. There's no true magic sauce just yet. At least not that I've found. But you have to, we look at it in a few different ways. Where again, we're looking at the vanity URLs or promo codes. So that helps you, be able to optimize within a certain channel, right? Because you have benchmarks against each other within that channel, as well as a baseline lift. If we look at a pre-post test, local tests are great too for this, because you have your control markets, you have your test markets, you have your national baseline, depending on what stage of the, brand that you're at, and what the budget levels look like as well. The how did you hear us survey is very helpful as well. You could add, you could see sort of what that percentage mix looks like and add multipliers to that direct conversion from a URL or a promo code. And then also testing, testing different media mixes across the board, and seeing how your overall DOS and overall performance backs out. So there's a few things to look at, and you sort of have to triangulate all of it together to get a good understanding.
When you say DOS, what do you mean by that?
So, sorry. So like direct and organic traffic, and then some branded search as well.
Okay, interesting. Sounds like you guys go with a little bit of a Frankenstein model as well. Just try to like take every single source and like stitch it together.
There's a little bit. I mean, we also do have our, you know, our multi-touch attribution, our media mix modeling tools as well. So, you know, I'd be remiss to mention that, but it's a little bit of all of it, right? I think it's important to see the full picture.
Cool. Any thoughts, Molly or Yousuf, on how you've sort of approached it?
Yeah, I've never heard it called Frankenstein model, but Frankenstein approach, but I like that. I might start using that from now on. You know, I always say there is no one best attribution model, and anyone who tells you that there is one is you know, hasn't seen them all. It's really it's really making sure that you're looking at your tools internally. I always say don't rely on one off-the-shelf third party. Don't rely on what one agency's model is telling you. You know, it might be a good signal, it might be a good indicator. But having other sources internally to triangulate. I always like to think about kind of direct signals. And so direct signals are things like Avital and Gavin mentioned, you know, that could be like a vanity URL for a podcast, or a promo code for a radio ad, or a spike model in TV. And so when we talk about spike model, we mean, you know, commercial airs on HGTV at noon. What happens in terms of site traffic and conversions from 12 o'clock to say 12:05 p.m. That's kind of a signal. It's like an early indicator, but it certainly doesn't represent kind of everything below the iceberg. So, you know, I think on one side, it's having those immediate signals to say, you know, is this one TV channel potentially driving a more immediate response than another TV channel? But like Gavin said, looking at your overall direct, organic, and branded search over the course of a campaign, whether that's a week or a month, to say what's the overall impact of this media spend, and then tracing it back to those indirect channels to say where can we make changes. But I love the Frankenstein analogy, so I might borrow that one from you.
Nice.
I can add my perspective and experience. So the one main thing is that every method has its limitations. And what you are trying to go for is get enough data to make a business decision. So for Eaze, as an example, the decision was, do we spend more on billboards, bus ads, or do we spend less? And then where do we spend more? Where do we spend less? If we can have that data, that's all that really matters. You put an error bar around it, that's great. For us, what worked really well was an attribution survey that was, you know, how did you hear about Eaze? Select all that apply. And like to connect the dots, why that worked so well was after someone's first order, when the attribution was, when the email was sent with the survey, customer satisfaction was so high, no pun intended, that the response rate was really great. You know, we had 30 to 40% of people, new customers, self-reporting how they heard about Eaze. So, you know, using some statistics, we could come up with here's a pretty good cost per acquisition from billboards and bus ads with an error bar that was good enough for us to make business decisions.
That's great. So it sounds like the HDYH, the How'd You Hear About Us, was really the most effective kind of attribution method that you were kind of relying on over at Eaze.
For the Eaze use case. Now, it's definitely not going to work. Like if your response rate is low, then you have to figure out something else.
Makes sense. And billboard is different from TV, right? Because there is no spike model. You know, your billboard's up for a week, so you don't really have a spike, right? So I guess you have to do something a little bit different there.
It builds more slowly.
And I think all of you basically give a great and fair answer that it is kind of a melding of lots of different data points coming in. But of those attribution methods, was there one that you kind of relied on more than others? Because obviously you can't look at all the different kind of angles all the time to make your kind of quick judgments on whether something was performing or not performing.
Yeah, so the best one, the immediate one, is this after purchase survey. And I feel like it also helps you, even if it's not the accurate answer, it helps you like compare like week over week. They on a daily basis, you get an understanding of how TV is performing, and you can adjust, as opposed to, let's say, marketing mix model that will give you maybe an answer once a quarter.
And to add to that, one piece of advice I like to give to brands, even if you haven't advertised online or you're potentially thinking about it, is it doesn't hurt to throw up a how did you hear about a survey, even in your early stages, whether you put that post-purchase or, in an email survey, but it gives you a really good baseline too. And throw channels on where you're not advertising, right? If you haven't turned on radio, throw radio on as an option and kind of get an idea for sort of what's your customer fault response rate. What percentage of people say a marketing channel that maybe you've never even been on yet. And you can always subtract that, almost like use that as a baseline and subtract it from what you're seeing when you actually turn on the channel. They're very low cost, doesn't take a lot of tech implementation. You can even do some testing where maybe you throw it against 10% of your checkout, so you make sure it doesn't, hurt conversion rate or hurt satisfaction or anything like that. And start to get some learnings now before you even turn on the channel. It's a great way to kind of lay the foundation before you even start putting money behind it.
It's funny to see a lot of that phantom reporting as well when you have when you're not running on certain channels and you get a certain percentage of those responses.
Really? So you'll get like 2% who say like, I heard of you from radio, when they never actually, when you don't have any radio ads?
Yeah.
And you can,
for some reason.
There's competition in the space, right? Maybe they thought it was Eaze, but they actually heard it was a different delivery service. Like, consumers, they're not perfect, right? The customer's not always right. And that can help you quantify that.
Okay, it's fascinating. It's interesting actually that all of you have mentioned how did you hear about us surveys as being one of the chief ways. I actually thought that would be like one of the lower ones because I don't know. It's just as a consumer, why would I fill that out? It just sounds like a waste of my 5 seconds, but no, I guess it's worked out pretty well for you guys.
You know what it does also though? It helps sort of, even if it wasn't the last touch in terms of the media type that the consumer is selecting, it's like the highest quality touch that they're selecting.
Gotcha. So they may have seen a TV commercial, but they may have gotten 5 other touches, but the TV commercial resonated with them. Very cool.
It helps identify that path too, like that touch path, because you can actually see if you're putting it in your checkout flow, you can actually see, well, this person actually converted on a paid brand search ad, but they responded TV. And so you can see the difference between what the consumer remembered and the path that they actually took. And that can be really helpful when you're trying to kind of make sure you're not double counting or sort of deconflicting the touch points, across your different digital and online channels.
That's fascinating. Do you ever turn off if you really, really, really want to closely test how much, say, TV or billboard or anything is running? Do you ever just say, let's turn off everything else for a week, or maybe for a day or two if you can't do a full week? Have you really ever tested that, or no? It's just too much of a mess.
We have not, and that's because if you turn it off for a week, you likely will not see the impact. When we shut off bus ads, we still had people responding for months after the bus ads were. So unless it's a massive increase over a decent amount of time or decrease, we didn't expect to see any delta.
Okay. And also I was curious about the reverse, shutting off your digital channels, maybe just turning off paid search for a few days and seeing if it had any decrease or anything like that. But that just might be a terrible idea. So we can jump to the next question, Grace. So how do you measure the ROAS of offline marketing efforts? Is it pretty much the exact same as how you would measure a paid social or a paid search campaign? Or do you kind of approach it a little bit differently?
I approach it a little differently. So this comes with more of a performance marketer bent, but as an example, if for our channels, on average, we're willing to spend $50 to acquire a user, because something like billboard or out of home or even experiential has what we believe is a meaningful brand value impact I will bake that in. So instead of $50 being the target I'm willing to spend at, I'd be willing to spend at 80. And that's kind of like how we at least try and, put a nod towards, okay, there's value that this is driving outside of just direct performance marketing.
And is that extra $30 just built in? That exact $30 number, is that just kind of arbitrary, or is there kind of science behind that?
It's arbitrary, but it's kind of a factor of the current moment in time. Like if we're other channels, if we don't have a lot of other channels, that will influence our decision how much we're willing to spend above the CPA target, as an example. But if we have a lot more, and there's a lot more room in some of the other ones, it'll be less liberal in terms of the upside or the benefit we'll give for brand.
Okay, that makes sense. Any other thoughts on how you kind of approach ROAS or ROAS for offline?
Yeah, I don't necessarily bake in the brand impact, although it's helpful. But I think the most important thing here is to understand who is really coming from a specific offline channel, because there is a different thing like doing this after a purchase survey and all this like promo code. You don't get a big certainty that these people coming from the specific channel. So the idea is to go and search for the ones that maybe fill the survey and also use the promo code, and also came in the 5 minutes after a TV ad was aired, and identify this group that is 100% coming from TV, and then calculate the ROI for this group and assume that this applies for all the other people who are coming from TV, which we don't know for sure who they are.
Interesting. Sounds difficult.
We have the good data there.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on how you kind of approach ROAS and how it does or doesn't differ from, the channels that people are a little more familiar with, like paid social and paid search?
I mean, I have the same process as Avital, where it's, isolating the users, the consumers that we know came, or we're very confident came from, these channels, whether it's the promo code, the how'd you hear about us, the URLs, the spiked attribution, the spiked traffic, isolating them, applying a ROAS or ROI on it, and then just using that sort of as a benchmark.
Cool. Makes a lot of sense, especially if people are actively kind of giving you that data again. And to that, have you noticed a difference in kind of LTV from offline folks versus paid search or paid social folks? I'd love to explore that.
Yeah, I noticed.
Oh, sorry, really quick. For those that don't know, LTV just means kind of the worth of a customer over their lifetime. It stands for lifetime value.
I don't know, not necessarily different LTV from offline to social, but what we noticed is when a channel is heavily dependent on promo codes and discounts, the LTV will be lower. So for example, direct mail, which is very much heavily dependent on promo codes, we see an LTV that is much lower than TV, for example, when we don't show promo code at all. So this is something we noticed.
Yeah, I hate to give like blanket advice of like these channels have higher LTV than others, because a lot of times the answer is like, it depends on the brand and product. But one of my favorite examples of this was when I was at NatureBox. We found that our LTV and the revenue generated from podcast consumers specifically was significantly higher than what we were seeing on paid social at the time. And that's for a lot of different reasons. We were a recurring subscription product, and so when you have recurring revenue, You want to be able specifically to really look back and say, all right, well, which channels are driving that higher recurring revenue? You know, I think for something like podcasts, for example, you tend to be, you know, the listener of a podcast ad tends to be well-educated, you know, tuning in for content, they're educating themselves. And so we would see that translate really well to recurring revenue for a subscription product. And the same has been the case for other companies that I've worked with on SiriusXM specifically. You know, again, SiriusXM is a channel where your consumer is paying, I think, something like $180 a year to have access to that content. And so for products that may be higher price point or, again, recurring revenue, you may start to see that those channels are driving significantly higher LTVs than a Facebook consumer, where maybe they're just scrolling and they're like, oh, that sounds interesting, I'll check it out. So I hate giving like blanket advice, but specifically there have been a number of times where I've seen podcasts and SiriusXM drive much higher LTV across many different products than social and even just kind of like direct and organic traffic.
Okay, no, that's great, and don't worry, I won't turn you in if that like ratio inverts with some products somewhere down the line. But no, that's exactly the answer I was looking for. Like, did it create higher revenue, LTV, whatever, than the other channels?
Because then you take that back and say, well, actually, I can afford to spend a little bit more to acquire a customer on podcast, and now I can spend a little bit more to invest in the channel and try new things. So, you know, I feel like we would have been really limited in our scale on podcast had we not specifically looked at the revenue we were driving, you know, per new customer from the channel. So, you know, different channels, different targets.
Absolutely, and less crowded too. So.
I can add one thing, adding to Avital's point that she was making around promo codes, which I think is really spot on. For us, when we did stuff like street teams, the LTV was inherently lower because we would be handing out a card that actually had a promo code on it. That was just a normal part of the process, and that brought down LTV. But if we were handing out without a promo code and just having them convince people, the LTV would be higher. And we tested that, but just the decrease in conversions that we got from not adding a promo code made it like not worth it to do from how many conversions can you actually get from this tactic.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So circling back on that, are you essentially saying that those users who did get those, you know, in-person cards maybe like stuck around for longer and had better retention and therefore their LTV was better? Or am I making a heavy assumption?
I think I'm saying not so much the card itself, like did they get a card, but what the card had on it. If it had a promo code, their LTV was lower than if it didn't. But if they had a promo card, we were able to get more conversions from a street team member being out on the street than not having it. And the decrease in conversions was so low, or was so dramatic that it only made sense to do it with the promo code on it.
Makes sense. So the total aggregate revenue was probably a lot better with the promo codes than going full price.
Yep.
Cool. We can jump to the next question, Chris. I just love the little images next to all the questions. What's the best way to get started with offline marketing? How does that change if you have very little budget to allocate to offline channels? That's a great one. I think a lot of people on this call right now are probably just doing digital and trying to figure this out themselves. Like, what's step one?
I can hop in if no one else wants to start.
Oh yeah, this is just anyone jump in. There's no sort of like round robin or anything.
Gavin, you unmuted, so why don't you start?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, again, it's it's sort of to Molly's point on the last question. It depends on the product and the audience, right? Who are you speaking to? If it's Life Alert, then you're probably going to want to test into linear TV, right? And at that point, you're able to isolate the offline channel you want to test into, and then, okay, how do we structure this test? What's the minimum investment needed to get a significant read that we're confident with? So, it really does come down to your core audience for that product. what's also another sort of like hacky thing to do is, we mentioned the Heidi House survey, and, I think it's really important speaking with your customers. And so, putting out a survey, asking them sort of what media types they use, just asking them where they spend their time. And that could give you a good sense as well of like, oh, okay, like maybe we should actually go into podcast or radio or, some other channel. And so those are sort of 2 points I have on this one.
I love those points.
That's a great piece of advice. Just ask someone what they consume. That's really easy.
I have 2 things to add. So the first one is, if you can do what I call a sizing exercise, you can typically eliminate like 8 out of 10 things, like growth experiments. And that applies to offline as well. Like you can do the back of the envelope math and figure out that XYZ offline channels does not even make sense to test. That's number one. And number 2, if you have very little budget, get really scrappy. So one thing I did was, just as an example, is I went outside a festival, Outside Lands, and it made my own picket sign, which was like its own small mini billboard that said, Eaze, get marijuana delivered, $20 off. And I got 2 ambassadors to do it for free as well. And we posted up right by the entrance where the majority of traffic was. And we just saw like how many conversions did we get that day as a proxy for like, does this tactic kind of work?
Yeah.
I love that idea, by the way. That's cool.
Thanks.
Yeah, and if you don't have the budget for TV, let's say your audience is on TV and it's exact one, and you don't really have the budget to get into TV, because TV requires high budget to start. You want to generate the reach, you just want to generate the frequency, and it's not always the best place to start if you're limited in budget. So you can always start with something small like OTT, where the budgets are not that high. You can just get a feeling, get an understanding of if your product works on video, and if your product works on a TV format, and then go from there.
Great. And can you, for the folks on this call, explain kind of the difference between OTT and like, normal TV?
Yeah, sorry. OTT, I mean everything that is basically connected. So if it's Hulu or Roku or Sling or any of these platforms, basically you buy, the buying experience is very similar to the digital. The attribution, not so much, it's more complex. But at least you can control the frequency, and you can enter this world with a much lower budget than linear. The scale is lower, so you don't get the scale of linear TV, but you get the read, you get the understanding if this channel works for you.
That's great advice. What's part of this question also kind of relays to what's maybe the easiest and fastest way to get up and running with offline marketing? Like, what's the channel, and how do you kind of create a process where you can get up and running within, like, let's say a week, or maybe even less than that? Are there any good ones that you guys recommend for that?
I think a week is pushing it.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, in terms of getting stood up quick, I mean, it's just, it's being scrappy. It depends on the resources that you have. If you could create creative in-house, if you could use, if it's audio, if you could just, you have a melodic voice. I hate the sound of my own voice, but if, someone that's in the organization can do the reads for you, or, use people in the organization for some of your TV ads, things like that. I think that's a scrappy way in terms of resources. In terms of getting stood up quickly, I think it's, especially in the beginning, using agencies is definitely the way to go.
Yeah, I definitely echo the sentiment on, if you're thinking about targeting a slightly older audience, call it 35, 45 plus, and you're evaluating TV versus radio, your speed on audio is so much faster. to Gavin's point, it's a lot faster to put together an audio ad. A lot of people forget about the creative production side of it. It's one of the reasons why podcasts can be a faster channel to speed up, again, because you're not doing any creative production in advance. Likely you're relying on the host of the podcast to do the read. But, just because you're ready to go doesn't, you really have to think through inventory. So for example, Q4 is a time of year where audio and podcast, as all advertising channels, get really crowded. And so, it's August now. So it's like, if you're thinking about a big push in Q4, you probably better get moving if you want to do audio on podcasts and radio and things like that. Whereas in Q1, there tends to be a lot more white space. There's a lot more inventory. Your prices can be better. You may be able to spin something up faster. So again, I hate saying it depends, but I feel like a week would probably be pretty aggressive. But even on the podcast side, a host might not have avails for a couple of weeks. And so those back and forth conversations, it's not as easy. It's typically not as, self-serve and quick as spinning up a Facebook campaign.
Makes a lot of sense. Thanks for that. Jump to the next one. The icon again. Has COVID changed anything in terms of offline marketing? Would maybe an offline channel be better now than it was before? Obviously, now that everyone's kind of stuck at home, what have your kind of COVID experiences been? Or the answer might be it's changed nothing, but would love to learn.
I can start. So for us at Freshly, first, when March arrives, basically the demand for the product went up anyway. So all the channels became super efficient. People wanted to have, to have food at home, not going out to do some, grocery shopping. And so basically just the demand naturally went up. But on top of that, what we saw on TV is people staying more at home. Like you said, viewership is going up, CPM is going down as a result. Not only that, a lot of the advertisers freaked out and pulled back money from TV. So we had a lot of opportunities to fire sell. So getting, these nice broadcast spots that usually cost $10,000s, we could purchase with nothing. So basically great opportunities on TV, and CPM goes down, made TV super efficient for us. But for us, it was like TV was the best one, but direct mail also looked great. People were at home reading their mail, response rate went up. Radio, not so much. Radio, when people were not driving, we actually saw CPA goes up there, so we had to pull back. So yeah, this was the impact.
Okay, nice. So I guess it was positive from a financial perspective for you guys. Cool. Any other COVID experiences, either helping or hurting kind of your campaigns? All right, we can jump to the next one. This is a pretty hard one. How do you size an offline opportunity before investing in it? Do you talk to other companies in your space? Do you rely on agencies for baselines or guardrails? Like, what goes into the research process?
I can start here. So for me, there's two things. The first one is create a funnel. And there's two parts to that funnel. Again, and this is with the more performance marketing bent. There's conversion rates on site. So if you actually get someone to the site, what's the conversion rate for them getting to sign up or whatever you're looking for, just in general. And then the other part is, you'll typically get from the media that you're buying some estimates of impressions or, other metrics. And just from that, you can typically get down to, all right, here's one key assumption, which is how many site visits do you get per impression? And then you can kind of like size like, okay, is this reasonable if I need to get this many people to the site in order for this to be ROI positive or not? And that way you can at least say, okay, these ones absolutely will not work. The more you do stuff, the more comps you also get. So as an example, when we did bus ads, after running them, we were able to get a pretty solid funnel and funnel data. And we knew how many bus impressions on average it would take to get someone to the site and then to convert at a CPA that we wanted. An opportunity came to us for wrapped cars, where they take an entire car and they wrap it. Just doing the math, we were able to figure out, okay, in order for this to be ROI positive, a wrapped car would have to be 75% as effective as a bus in order for it to be profitable. Now, for us, it was like very clear that, okay, it's a pretty big stretch to assume that a car is going to be 75% as effective as a bus. And so we were able to say, without doing it, this probably is not going to be ROI positive. Let's look at some other opportunities.
Nice. That's a pretty methodical approach as well across all of that. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I like to leverage third-party data. There's a lot of big data companies out there. Nielsen's a great example, and trying to, and again, it depends on your budget and what you're able to accomplish with your resources, but you're able to really see what that total population is of a media channel, of consumers that are using that media channel, and what's the composition of your target audience against those media channels. And so what is your max potential? And then then looking at your of reach, and then looking at your own site metrics and your own internal data of saying, okay, our conversion rates are XYZ, and we think that we could hit X% of this target at whatever frequency, and X are going to convert. And so that's sort of the way that it's sort of marrying the two approaches there.
Nice. And so of third-party data providers, you'd put Nielsen at kind of like the top of your list?
Nielsen's good. MRI is another good one. Who else? There's a few other ones. Millward Brown, I've used in the past as well. Yeah.
Cool.
I have two ways that I would answer that. The first is to piggyback off of what Gavin said, is specifically on the podcast side, there's tools where it's sort of like smart listening tools where you can access to see where your competitors advertising, where are companies who are trying to acquire a like consumer. So let's say you're a home services brand and you're trying to acquire homeowners. You can look to see, okay, what are other companies that are trying to acquire homeowners? Is it Angie's List? Is it refi mortgage companies? Are there banks? Are there services that are specifically targeting homeowners? Where are they advertising? And what do their trends look like in advertising? It's not going to sound very exciting, but there aren't a lot of new ideas in marketing, to be honest. And so looking at what what other people have done, what other brands have done, and where they're having success, you can start to see patterns, right? You can see patterns in, this brand advertised on a show for 6 months and then suddenly stopped. This brand only advertised on a show for 2 weeks and then suddenly stopped. Again, it's, everything's worth testing yourself, but you can start to kind of see some patterns when you're looking at what other like-minded companies are doing. And then secondly, this isn't really on sizing necessarily, but it's kind of thinking about like, what's the next step for you when you've already had success on a specific channel, on a specific medium. And that might be, are there ways that we can continue to reach this consumer, but for a lower cost? So for example, let's say you've had a lot of success, at HomeLight, we had a lot of success on linear TV, especially on channels like news and sports, where we had seen a lot of success. Well, after a while, you're going to just continue to invest in the day parts and the times of day where you see strong response, but you're not ultimately going to reach more consumers necessarily by doing that. Can you reach those consumers the same number of times? Can you achieve the same frequency through a different channel approach? So for example, the same person that's watching, ESPN in the evening time after dinner may also be listening to that channel on their drive to work. this is a pre-COVID example, but the example sort of still stands, right? Which is, well, if I can reach that person while he or she is driving to work at a significantly lower cost on a different channel, like SiriusXM, like streaming radio, well, now I'm getting the frequency that I need to drive, conversion, but I'm doing it at a lower cost, which effectively is going to drive down your CPA. It's going to increase your ROAS, and then give you some kind of buffer in your budget to start testing new things. So, it's not just about like, should I test this new channel, but can I also, by adding new offline channels, can I overall increase the efficiency of my current channel? And Gavin's examples about MRI and Nielsen are great ways to do that on the broadcast side, and a number of other things when you're looking across different channels. It's all about trying to get that audience the right number of touch points, but potentially at a lower cost than whatever it was that you were doing before.
That makes sense. Also, your point about just seeing what your competitors are doing and assuming that they have smart marketers behind them, particularly if they're a bigger company with a bigger budget than you. I've seen that go wrong sometimes when I've realized after the fact that the people actually running the campaigns had no fucking clue what they were doing, and were just basically like throwing money into a furnace because they didn't know any better. And I was like, they were not the ones to copy. Okay. Before, or like have eventually talked to like the CMO at one of those companies and realized, wow, that person really had no method to like burning $1 million. But yeah, that was where I definitely used to like live and die by that as well. Like if the competitors are doing it, they have more money, let's just do it, or at least try it. But unfortunately, it didn't always work out that way.
And sometimes, not just your competitors, but just, like-minded companies, just talking to them. Like I'm actually really surprised just by how, symbiotic the ecosystem is, and how growth marketers tend to, at least not with direct competitors, but with like-minded companies. It's a small world. People are generally pretty willing to share things that have worked well for them if, they don't feel like you're going to eat their lunch. Pun intended, Avital. And so, what I find that, just talking to other growth marketers is a really good way to start to learn, and start to get ideas for channels that may be otherwise harder to size up.
Absolutely. I love that. And that's actually how I've even kept on learning how growth works, since I don't touch a campaign and I haven't touched in years, how all of this works. So I get to interview people all day and just like, what worked, what didn't work? Tell me about your campaign, tell me about your channels, and then start to learn patterns. And and to your point about people being transparent, I've learned that growth folks and anyone who's entrepreneurial is incredibly transparent and does not care giving you all the information of everything that worked and did not work. So corporate-y type of people, not so much. They're always like trying to CYA. But just approaching 10 smart people who work at really cool companies are companies that you might want to imitate with your ads, is actually a great research method on how to go about doing this, because at least 2 or 3 are going to reply to you and tell you everything they know. Let's go to the next one. I think we dug into this one previously. We can go to the next one. That was interesting. How do you know to keep adding another marketing channel into your mix or not? What's kind of the methodology on whether, let's say you're on podcast and you're on TV, to also add on billboards or to not? What's kind of like the go or no go decision making kind of factors?
For me, I think it's always useful to have more channels. So I would always want to add more just to increase my diversity and make sure that, I don't put all my eggs in one basket. But it's kind of related to the other question. So the answer will be like, first, is my audience there? And I can leverage all these third-party tools to understand if my audience is there. And then how scalable is this channel? So if it's, how lean is my team? Because it's worth our time investing in channel. It's not super scalable. So yeah, I feel like this would be the 2 factors that will contribute to my decisions if I want to add more offline channels, and yeah, what my competitors are doing and all that stuff that we already said.
Interesting. So you might not hang out outside of a music festival,
No.
trying to sell people stuff if it's not scalable.
Yes. At this point, where it depends on the size of the company and where we are right now. But if we are full scale, yeah, so definitely I will prioritize advertising on TV than sitting outside of the festival.
All right, I need to clarify around that point. One, the festival's great. Two, we do that as a quick and dirty test and then apply math. So example, you stand outside one festival, you know how many hours it took, what the cost was, and how many conversions you get. Then you can say, all right, there's X number of festivals every year in the US. Apply the number of conversions to the number of festivals. Is this worth our time? From like a scale. I think Avital is like right on. That's why we do sizing beforehand, is we will X out ideas, not just based off of like, is there a chance they'll be ROI positive, but also do they meet a scale threshold? We believe we meet that. And so the festivals kind of passed that potential, like back of the envelope. That's why we went and tested it.
Okay. And I've met the guy who ran kind of Uber's like hit the streets and hand everyone a card thing too. So for even companies that are like at massive scale, things that don't necessarily easily scale can, to your point, make sense as long as the math backs out. Because he said the math backed out, so why not, you know? And then there's also good kind of branding where you're getting whatever 100,000 people. I don't know how many people go to outside lands. It's probably nowhere near 100,000, but who are walking in and out and seeing your brand as well. So it makes sense to be a win-win.
One analysis that I think is really important to do when you're looking to add a new marketing channel, it's not necessarily an indicator, but it's sort of what's my, like, how can I mitigate risks across other parts of my offline mix or outside of my overall acquisition portfolio if you're looking across both digital and offline. So if you're going to invest, say, 5% of your budget in a given month on a new test, you know, put in like, what's the worst case CPA you might drive, right? Like what if, and I'll just kind of benchmark it, like what if my current offline CPA is $50? And I really need to make sure that my overall offline CPA stays at $50. Well, if I'm going to do 10% of my budget on a test where I could drive, say, a $250 CPA, you know, how much lower does the rest of my offline mix have to get to be able to allow me to potentially take a test that, you know, kind of bombs, to be honest, or only part of the test works. And so looking at actually what am I currently doing and are things that I can do to drive my CPA down across the rest of my offline portfolio or across, you know, all of my acquisition budget to say, all right, are there things that we actually need to cut in order to make room for this additional testing? And again, it's going to vary based on the business, the time of year. You know, Q1 could be a great time because you're going to get better ad inventory. You know, it depends on sort of seasonality of your business and of the channel. But I think that's also really important when you're looking at taking, you know, somewhere between maybe 5 to 10% of your budget and throwing it against something new, which is, if this goes to worst case scenario, what do I have to do to the rest of my budget? What do I have to do to the rest of my marketing mix to make sure I don't blow whatever my targets are for the month, and then acting accordingly before you do that, because otherwise you could sink your ship if you don't look at that part.
It makes a lot of sense. We'll jump to the next one. Is local testing the best way to kind of step into a new offline marketing campaign or channel? Is that generally what you guys do when you're doing a channel that's brand new to your brand? Or is there kind of a different step number one?
You know, I think it's a good way from a broadcast perspective. So, you know, from linear television to terrestrial radio, I think it's a great way to test it. But this also goes back to, you know, who is your audience, because you might find that, a young family in San Francisco is your target, and they're heavy podcast listeners, and you want to go into podcast instead, and you're not going to test podcasts on a local level. So it does depend. I know we've been saying that a lot, but you know, from when it comes to more of like broadcast media, yeah, I think local is a good way to test.
Makes sense. And you have a good point that not all channels are able to be tested on a local level anyways, right? So, yeah. any other thoughts on, is local testing the best way, or is there another kind of really interesting first step that you would kind of go about even maybe before local testing, or yeah?
I think local testing can also make a lot of sense if you're a brand that's, either have already done some offline testing or you have such a large digital budget. If you really want to look at kind of incremental impact that you're making outside of just sort of the direct signals like vanity URLs, promo codes, and spike model, and you're worried because you're spending, 6-7 figures a month in digital channels, and you want to be able to measure that lift, that's going to be it's going to cost a lot of money to lift that tide. And so in some cases, local testing can be a much better way to invest a little bit less money, but to actually get a better read if you feel like, well, we'd have to spend a lot to even see a lift. And, that's certainly not something that, a risk that we're willing to take. So in those cases, if you're a large national brand that maybe has done a lot of digital, then sometimes in individual local markets can actually make a lot of sense out of the gate.
Cool.
Yeah, and CPMs on TV and radio are more expensive on the local side, which is fine. We can always adjust the CPMs and make the projections for when we go national. The only thing, sometimes the media mix is a bit different and not necessarily representative. So for example, with TV, the mix will be on the local side will be more broadcast channels versus, more linear cable when you go national. So I would maybe, it's a good way, like Molly said, to test and to get an indication without throwing all this money, but there are limitations. So whoever chooses this method needs to be aware.
Yeah. The cost pers are quite expensive, so you have to adjust for that when projecting out what a national campaign.
Times 4 to 7x the CPM that you're going to pay at the local level.
Yeah.
Interesting. But one of the reasons to do it, even though it's a higher CPM, is to understand your incoming revenue per user, and then you can back it out on a national level when the CPMs are going to go lower.
Yeah, but sometimes the media is not really similar. So even with doing this, with applying this, CPM ratio, which is fine, it's a great way. Sometimes maybe the media is not the best representative to what you will see in the national scale.
Interesting.
There's not a lot of local. There's not a lot of local cable inventory that it just doesn't exist. You can't if you're testing TV only, you cannot put together a local cable plan that would in any way mimic what you would be doing at the national cable level. You're going to have to rely a lot more on local broadcast. And just because it works on local broadcast, it's not going to translate, like Avital said, to the national. So there's a lot of variables that have to be controlled. And again, you can back out the performance of it, but it can come at a higher CPM cost or out-of-pocket cost, or it can't necessarily translate to the national level.
Interesting. Okay. What's different? Is it the creative, or is it like the type of shows that you're going with, or like the demographic of who's watching that show, or like what are the main differences between local versus national? Yeah.
So like when you're running local, you could have, again, I'm going to throw kind of a broad number out there, but when you're running a local TV campaign, you might have 50% of your media in broadcast. So broadcast being ABC, NBC, CBS, kind of the broadcast channels. Whereas if you're, running a national TV program, you can very easily put, 80, 90, even 100% of your budget in the cable side, HGTV, CNN, ESPN, things like that. But there just doesn't exist a lot of local cable inventory. So you have to run broadcast media, and broadcast is priced really differently because, as you can imagine, it has tremendous reach, right? Like the reach of broadcast of NBC is far greater than, obviously some of even the biggest cable shows. So it's just, it's not apples to apples, like Avital said. You have to factor in the differences in those channels. There is a little bit of creative, like for example, when you run in broadcast media, a lot of times the standards and processes as well. And I've run into this a number of times, whereas when you run your creative on cable TV, the S&P process tends to be a little bit lower for what creative can get approved. And then if you want to really quickly buy a spot on NBC or CBS, going through their standards and processes and the types of disclaimers and the types of sort of substantiation that you have to have in order to run a creative on broadcast, it might actually not pass muster on the broadcast side. That can be a real bummer if you only have, say, one creative and you really want to run it.
Fascinating. Okay. I actually didn't know that. Any other kind of like differences, Avital, that you were thinking of between like local versus kind of national, or?
No, just like Molly said, it's the media is different, so the demographics necessarily is going to be different. Broadcast stations versus cable stations are just very different from one another.
Cool, makes sense. Jump on the next one. Great. Can you guys kind of run through a really, really successful campaign you've run? And as a counter, feel free to also include like a massive like crash and burn failure as well. Both very relevant for learning.
Sure, I'm happy to start. And on the successful side, and I think this question really comes down to, at least my answer comes down to creative here. So one campaign that we did that was really successful was, and kudos goes to the creative director, Libby Cooper, on the brand marketing team. But it was one that was, the theme was effectively hello marijuana, goodbye X. So hello marijuana, goodbye worries. Hello marijuana, goodbye hangover. And the creative was really great. It spoke to the audience and it was kind of funny. And what was most successful is, one, it was our first time on that medium, like bus ads and billboards, and it generated a lot of buzz. And probably the best thing that happened about it was we had a bus with an ad, full bus ad that said, hello marijuana, goodbye worries, that hit a meter maid. And the pictures that were taken of that were amazing, and then just turned into really great digital ads.
That's awesome. I saw those pictures. They're hilarious.
And then unsuccessful, I'll talk about, is actually the street teams, which is why we tested that. So street teams in different fashions, getting them to be out on the street or outside a festival, handing out cards, just actually the economics didn't work, nor did the scale. And so I had to push really hard for the organization to not do it, because what they would see is one of our competitors, Cali Chill, blanket San Francisco with these ambassadors, handing out cards. And I was like, look, we ran it ourselves. The economics do not work. The actual person who's running it at Cali Chill used to work at Eaze, and is doing it regardless. And so we had to stay disciplined. We didn't do it, and Cali Chill went bankrupt, actually.
Yeah, which is a great circle back to the conversation me and Molly were having earlier, where sometimes you want to copy your competitors, but then sometimes you learn the real truth that they really didn't know what they were doing, whatever, and you're like, oh wow, well, maybe that wasn't a good idea. Avital or Molly, any examples of some really great campaigns or really ones that didn't work out too well?
Sure. So I think the most successful campaigns are the ones that have a good balance and do well the combination between basically achieving growth goals and brand awareness goals, which is, I cannot stress enough how hard it is to achieve both in one campaign. So one thing that went well for us, actually at Wix, when I still was working at Wix.com, we had our annual Super Bowl campaign, which is always a great celebration, and it's never meant to meet growth goals. It's always about getting the reach, and it's a Super Bowl. But the thing that you need to do after the Super Bowl, and this is what we did, is basically leverage the creative, leverage the fact that you managed to get to so many eyeballs, and then build a very good DR campaign based on that on all of your channels. So a 360 campaign that use the same creative, but the message is really different. It's very much DR, and making sure that you're working on frequency in all your channels. So if it's TV, if it's YouTube, if it's social, if it's brand search, so everything is working together. So this is something that was very, very successful for us and worked for months after the actual Super Bowl campaign.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I think one of the most successful campaigns I've run was when I was at NatureBox, really stepping into podcast advertising when it was in its early sort of podcast advertising was very much in its kind of nascent stage. And so sort of the advice that I would give is don't be afraid to step into an emerging channel, even if you haven't seen competitors do it, even if a lot of people aren't doing it yet, because that's the time where you can test things typically at lower cost. In the case of podcast advertising, we work directly with podcast hosts. I'm talking about, you know, guys and gals in their basement, you know, not going through networks or going through agencies, and really being willing to kind of work and learn alongside of a new publisher. I think this advice honestly translates to digital channels as well. I think it translates to anything in marketing. But for us, I think the reason why it was so successful is because we were willing to take a risk, also willing to kind of just try new things and work with the hosts and figure it out as we went. Low out-of-pocket costs initially. In terms of one of my most unsuccessful offline campaigns was when I did a local campaign where I only ran on one channel, which was radio. Again, it's not to blanket say like, oh, you can never do just one local channel and it won't work. But I think the lesson that I took from that was we really relied on only one medium, and just it was impossible for us to get the frequency that we would need to be able to drive efficiency and just really drive any response. And my takeaway there was really, you can, again, it gets back to the point I made earlier. If you can reach the same person multiple times using different cost per touches, then you might be able to drive more of a response. And so that was a big takeaway for me, that, you know, it's always like, if you invest too little or you don't actually ever have the ability to drive a response, then that was a waste of money. I'll try not to make that one again.
Makes a lot of sense. So two things. We are 7 minutes over time, so thank you guys for sticking on board. And we're going to wrap up. And then number two, it's Molly's birthday right now. So thank you for spending your birthday with us, talking about offline marketing, attribution, and all of the above. So happy birthday. I don't know, do you clap for birthday? Is that what happened? I don't know.
This is the most people I was going to see on my birthday. So honestly, this is a real treat, pun intended.
Awesome. All right. Thanks a lot to all of our panelists. We learned a ton. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to email us. My email is anish@bringruckus, ANISH @bringruckus.com. Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining.